The sizzling sound hit just a second before the pain. One moment I was leaning over the stove, adjusting the burner under the sauce I had spent an hour preparing. The next, a flash of heat and a deafening crash sent the entire room into stunned silence. My father had ripped the cast iron pan off the burner and flung it across the kitchen with all the strength in his military-trained arms. It struck my upper back with a burning impact so violent it knocked me straight into the fridge. My legs gave out before I registered the scream that left my own mouth. I hit the floor hard, my palms scraping against the tile as I tried to catch myself, the heat from the sauce still spreading through my shirt and into my skin. The room smelled like basil and smoke, but under it all was the sharp stink of scorched fabric and flesh. He stood over me, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling like a beast after the kill. His voice cut through the shock like a knife. "That is what you get for ruining dinner, Naomi. You want to cook, then do it right." Behind him, the guests sat frozen at the dining table. My mother clutched a napkin to her mouth like she was stifling a cough, but never moved. My brother Trevor glanced quickly at our cousin across the table and looked away. Someone coughed. No one stood up. I was still on the floor, gasping, trying to push myself up with trembling arms as the heat pulsed along my shoulder blades. My father's words repeated again like a drumbeat. "You ruined the sauce. You ruined everything." My mother finally moved, but not toward me. She stepped past me and turned off the burner. The silence was louder than the clang of the pan had been. I heard the scrape of a chair as someone resumed eating. Plates clinked, forks moved. Conversation slowly resumed in tight little murmurs like someone had dropped a plate instead of a pan onto a girl. I pressed my forehead to the cold floor tiles and thought, if I cry, they will win. So I didn't. I just lay there and listened to them pretend nothing had happened. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. A 2-story white home with navy shutters, a flag on the porch, and flower beds my mother kept pristine even in the Texas heat. We lived in a neighborhood where every lawn was trimmed like a competition, and everyone waved even if they could not remember your name. My father, Russell Carter, was a local legend, a retired Army chef who opened a diner on Main Street and served the best cornbread in town, or so the newspaper said. People loved him. They praised his discipline, his work ethic, his stories about feeding battalions in the desert. He could flip a pancake with military precision and tell a joke that made old ladies at church fan themselves. What they did not see was how that discipline followed us home. My mother, Joanne, was what folks called gracious. She chaired bake sales and brought casseroles to funerals and hosted dinner parties with cloth napkins and real silver. Her hair was always perfect, her smile always ready. But it was rehearsed. My brother Trevor was the golden child, 3 years older, star quarterback, clean-cut, always said the right thing. Dad showed off his trophies like they were medals from a war. On the fireplace mantel, Trevor's framed photos multiplied while mine were confined to the corner shelf. I was quiet. Not rebellious, not loud, just invisible. I liked cooking, drawing, writing recipes in a little notebook I kept under my mattress. But that was not enough. Not for him. Not for them. They never said it, but the message was clear. Naomi was the shadow. Naomi was the burden. Dad expected military obedience at home. We woke up early on weekends to clean. He checked our beds for wrinkles in the sheets. At dinner, we sat straight hands visible, napkin folded. If I spoke without being asked, my mother would widen her eyes just slightly. That was my cue to be quiet. If I laughed too loud, Dad would clear his throat and say, "Keep it down, you are not at the circus." Every rule was about appearance, presentation. No one cared what I felt. They cared how we looked. I remember once my teacher called home because I had missed a few homework assignments. I had been sick but forgot to bring the doctor's note. That night, Dad made me kneel in the hallway for an hour in silence. He said, "This is how you learn to take responsibility." My mother walked by 3 times. Not once did she ask if I was okay. The next day, she packed me an extra sandwich like that would erase the night before. At church, we smiled. We wore matching clothes on Easter and took photos in front of the altar. People called us the Carters such a fine family. But behind the smiles, I learned to listen closely to footsteps, to the tone of voice, to the way the silverware clinked against plates. Because at any moment the mood could shift, and when it did, no one would defend me. My father always said respect is earned, but in his world it was demanded. And my mother believed keeping the peace meant keeping silent. I never understood how Trevor fit in so well, how he could live in the same house and never flinch when Dad slammed his hand on the table. I used to think maybe he was just lucky, but later, I realized he chose his silence. He chose comfort over truth. Our house was clean, quiet, efficient like a machine. And like a machine, it ran best when no one questioned the rules. I stopped asking why. I started memorizing which drawers creaked, which floorboards needed to be stepped over to avoid attention. I learned that perfection was expected but never rewarded. That invisibility was safer than being seen. And still, sometimes I wondered if anyone ever really saw me at all. I was 17 and already shrinking into myself so deeply that even I barely recognized who I was becoming. But all of it, the silence, the smiles, the rules would come crashing down with one thrown pan, one ruined dinner, and one moment where the mask slipped and no one could pretend anymore. It was not the first time I had felt pain explode across my back, and it would not be the last. Long before that night in the kitchen with the cast iron pan, I had learned how violence disguised as discipline crept into your bones like a shadow you could not shake. I was 9, the first time he hit me hard enough to make my ears ring. I had spilled a glass of milk onto the counter while trying to reach the cereal. His footsteps came fast and the slap came faster. I fell back against the cabinet, the sting blooming across my cheek like a red-hot stamp. He did not yell, he just said, "Be more careful, Naomi," then handed me a towel. That moment lodged in my body in a place no one could see. I told no one. At school, I said I tripped. The teacher believed me. I was careful after that, but careful was never enough. There were rules I never knew until I broke them, and then it was too late. When I was 10, I forgot to set the table before dinner. He made me eat on the floor. My mother walked past me, her heels clicking against the tile, not saying a word. When I was 12, I left a ring from a cold glass on the coffee table, and he made me hold ice in my bare hands until they burned. He said, "Now you know what condensation costs." I learned to hide bruises under sleeves, to flinch without flinching, to apologize even when I did not understand what I had done. I started keeping a little notebook where I wrote down every time he touched me in anger. I hid it under my mattress behind a box of recipe cards. I called it my training manual, like he called his outbursts. My mother used to say, "Your father just wants you to be strong," like that was a reason to be hurt. She brought me ginger tea the night he shoved me against the hallway mirror for stepping on his shoes and told me that strong girls do not cry. But crying was not what I feared. What I feared was disappearing into the version of me that accepted all of it as normal. At 13, I started staying after school longer than necessary. I joined clubs I did not care about. The librarian let me sit behind the desk while she closed up, and I told her I was waiting for my mom to finish work. I was not. I just could not go home yet. At 14, I started burning toast on purpose so he would not let me cook. It did not work. He said, "Burned food teaches patience." At 15, I entered a baking competition at school and won second place. I came home beaming with my certificate. He did not look up from the newspaper. "What does that get you, Naomi? A job at a grocery store?" I left the certificate on the fridge for a week before it disappeared. No one said where it went. At 16, he caught me watching a cooking show on TV when I should have been cleaning, and pulled the plug from the wall. He said, "Stop dreaming, start scrubbing." That night, I took an ice pack from the freezer, not for a bruise, but for the ache inside me that would not go away. I pressed it to my chest and curled up on the kitchen floor, the same spot where he would one day throw a pan at me. I remember once finding an old family videotape labeled Christmas 2003. I was maybe 11 in it, wearing a red dress, standing stiff next to the tree. My father was behind the camera, telling Trevor to smile bigger. Then he turned it on me and said, "Naomi, wipe that frown off your face. You are ruining the picture." In the video, I smile. It looks wrong. It looks hollow. I watched it alone in the middle of the night, rewinding that moment over and over until I could hear his voice even after I turned the tape off. By 17, I had learned how to vanish in plain sight. I knew how to walk soundlessly, how to shrink my laughter, how to keep my thoughts inside my teeth. I kept a small tin in my closet full of little things that reminded me I was still a person. A broken whisk from my first cake, a recipe torn from a magazine, a photo of me and my friend Camilla from summer camp before we lost touch. I kept a pack of gel ice behind a row of books where no one would find it. I used it more often than I care to admit. I never said I was being abused. I did not have that language. To me, it was just home. But deep down, I knew it was wrong. I knew because I was always hiding. I knew because the worst part of being hurt was knowing no one in that house would ever admit it happened, not even to themselves. And yet every day I woke up and tried again. I tried to be good enough, fast enough, invisible enough. I tried to survive with my notebook and my ice packs and my fading hope that maybe one day I would cook something someone would actually thank me for. Something they would eat, not with criticism, but with joy. I never expected that instead they would eat while I bled and pretend nothing had gone wrong. That kind of silence is louder than any scream. In the middle of all that silence, all that fear and order, there was one place where I felt like I existed: the kitchen. It started when I was 8, barely tall enough to see over the counter, but already fascinated by the way my mother whipped egg whites into peaks or kneaded dough until it sighed beneath her fingers. She never let me touch anything at first, just watched and copied in a notebook I kept hidden under the bread box. By 10, I was making grilled cheese without burning the pan, and by 12, I could bake cinnamon rolls that didn't need store-bought icing. Cooking gave me what the rest of the house stole: control, peace, and the ability to create something that no one could erase. In the kitchen, I was not invisible. I was precise, useful. And for a while, that felt like safety. My father had rules about the kitchen, of course. He taught Trevor how to season steak, how to sear meat like a soldier, and bragged about how men who could cook were rare and valuable. When it came to me, it was different. He said if I wanted to play house, I better learn how to keep the kitchen spotless. He never praised the meals I made, only the way the stove was scrubbed afterward. But I clung to it anyway. I watched cooking shows and secret memorized techniques, practiced chopping vegetables to the rhythm of my heartbeat. I used food as a language when my voice was unwelcome. I made my father's favorite chili every year on Veterans Day, hoping he would notice the extra cumin, but he never did. Once I tried to make croissants from scratch after finding an old French cookbook in the library. I stayed up till midnight, letting the dough rise, kneading it like I was trying to fold away all the sharp edges of my life. He threw them out the next morning, saying they were too greasy. I cried in the pantry with the empty flour bag still in my lap. I applied to a culinary summer program in Dallas when I was 16 and hid the acceptance letter in my sock drawer. I knew the tuition was covered by scholarship, but I also knew he would never let me go. When he found the letter, he burned it in the sink right in front of me. He said no daughter of mine is going to flip burgers for a living. You want to cook, cook here. Clean here. Be useful here. I remember the way the ashes floated up like little ghosts of everything I had wanted. After that, I stopped trying to leave. I just cooked, quietly, perfectly, desperately, hoping that maybe if I did it well enough, someone would look up. Someone would say thank you. But they never did. Not really. My mother would mutter about how the roast was dry or the salt was too strong. My brother would eat with his earbuds and barely tasting. My father would lecture about efficiency, about how in the army they cooked for 200 men and did not complain. So I cooked alone. I taught myself knife skills with apples. I made jam from bruised fruit I found in the back of the fridge. I built flavors like I was building a fortress. Food became the only thing that was mine. My only rebellion was making things too pretty, too delicate for his approval. Little cakes with piped buttercream and hand-twisted pasta. He hated it. Said it was fussy. But I kept going, because every time I folded dough or balanced spice, I felt a little bit more like myself. And that mattered, even in that house, even with him standing over my shoulder. The kitchen was the only place where I wasn't just surviving. I was trying to live. The night it happened was supposed to be a celebration. My brother Trevor had just accepted a job offer from a big accounting firm in Dallas, and my parents were hosting a family dinner to show him off. There were flowers on the table and white napkins folded like swans. My mother had even brought out the crystal glasses we only used for holidays. The kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary and beef, and I had spent all afternoon preparing the meal because that was the role I had been assigned in our family. I cooked, I served, I stayed out of the way. That day, my father had come home early to supervise. He stood over my shoulder like a general inspecting a soldier, correcting everything. Too much oil. Lower the heat. Stir faster. I said nothing and obeyed. That was the safest thing to do. My mother flitted in and out adjusting candles and setting out cheese plates like we were expecting royalty. Trevor arrived in a collared shirt with his girlfriend Abby, a woman I had only met once, but who already had a framed photo on our mantel. Everyone laughed when Trevor made a joke about college, and my father slapped him on the back like they were equals. I stayed in the kitchen. I plated everything with care. The roast had come out just right, crisp on the edges, tender in the center. The potatoes were golden, the salad was fresh, but the sauce, the béarnaise, had curdled slightly. I had been distracted by my father's shouting about the bread rolls being too soft, and when I turned back to the pan, the heat had climbed too high. The sauce split. I tried to fix it, but it was too late. I added butter, whisked furiously, even strained it, but it was still wrong. I hesitated before bringing it to the table, thought about tossing it and lying, but I brought it anyway because I did not want to make things worse. He noticed after the first bite. Everyone else said nothing, just kept eating. But he put his fork down and wiped his mouth with a napkin like he was preparing to deliver a sermon. He turned to me slowly and said, "What is this?" I said quietly the sauce didn't set right. I tried to fix it. He looked at me like I had spit on the table. "You tried to fix it," he repeated, voice rising. "This is how you thank us. You ruin his dinner. You ruin everything." Abby glanced at Trevor. My mother said, "Russell, please." But it was too late. He stood so fast his chair screeched against the floor. I barely had time to turn when I heard the pan lift from the stove behind me. It was still half full of hot sauce. I felt the heavy metal hit my back with a wet slap pain blooming instantly as the liquid burned through my shirt and into my skin. I fell forward onto the kitchen tiles, the air knocked out of me. The room went silent. I could not see anyone's face, but I could hear forks dropping and someone gasping. My hands scrambled at the floor, trying to push myself up. The pain in my back was white hot. The pan clattered somewhere near the sink. He was breathing heavy above me and said, "That's what happens when you disappoint people, Naomi. You want to play chef, you better learn to cook." My mother whispered something sharp and urgent, but I could not hear it over the blood rushing in my ears. My face was inches from the floor, the sauce soaking through my shirt. I thought for a second I would faint. I thought maybe that would be better. Then I heard it, the worst sound of all, the clinking of silverware resuming, someone taking another bite, a chair sliding back in. My father returned to the table like nothing had happened. My mother turned the burner off. No one came to help me. I laid there for a full minute before I managed to crawl to the fridge and use the handle to pull myself up. I stumbled into the bathroom and locked the door, stripped off my shirt with shaking fingers, and stared at the angry red burns already rising on my skin. I tried to cool it with cold water, but the pain made me hiss through my teeth. My reflection looked like someone I did not know. I could hear them out there still talking, laughing again, like nothing had happened. I dressed in a hoodie to cover the burn, and when I came back out, my mother said in a low voice, "Go sit and eat, and don't make a scene." And so I did. I sat in silence with the pain radiating across my back and watched them toast to Trevor's future with champagne. No one looked at me, not even once. That night, after everyone had left and the dishes were done and the kitchen wiped clean like nothing had happened, I went to my room and shut the door slowly. My back throbbed with every step and the skin beneath my hoodie felt raw, as if it might peel away with the fabric. I stood in front of the mirror and lifted the sweatshirt enough to see the mess of red and blistering patches across my shoulder blades. I couldn't breathe for a second. I didn't cry, though. I just stared. I turned off the light and lay on my side, curled tightly, trying not to let the fabric touch the burn. My phone vibrated beside me. Group chat. My mother had sent a message. She wrote she ruined a very important night for all of us. Let's not reward her behavior by giving it attention. Then Trevor chimed in. Just let her sulk, it's what she always does. The words sat on the screen like acid burning holes through the little hope I still had that maybe someone would say what happened was wrong. Instead, they closed ranks like they always did and made me the villain. I took screenshots slowly, methodically, and saved them to a folder I renamed Truth. I felt numb, not from pain, but from recognition, because this wasn't new. This was the pattern. Hurt me, blame me, erase me. I woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon and my mother humming. I came down to find her plating eggs like any other Saturday. She glanced at me, then turned back to the stove. Sit, eat, and try not to act like a martyr. My father was already sitting at the table reading the newspaper as if he hadn't launched a burning weapon at his daughter 12 hours earlier. I poured water for myself because reaching for hot coffee felt like a threat. As I sat, my father said without looking up, "We all have bad days, but what matters is keeping your head down and moving on." I said nothing. My mother added, "Maybe next time don't experiment with fancy sauces if you can't get them right." That sentence broke something in me that had been holding on by threads. I realized they weren't confused. They weren't trying to justify what happened. They knew, and they had chosen to twist it into something I had caused, something I deserved. The pain on my back was real, but the gaslighting was deeper. It carved itself into the space between my ribs, the way you forget how to breathe when someone tells you your reality isn't real. I looked down at my plate and watched the eggs steam and thought how strange it was that the world kept spinning while mine had cracked in half. I stood up without a word, walked to my room, and closed the door gently, like I was sealing off the last bit of myself they would ever have access to. That morning marked the beginning of something different. Not loud, not defiant, but solid and quiet. I was done waiting for them to see me. I would make them. I told them I slipped. That was the first lie I fed the woman at the ER check-in desk. It came out of my mouth before I even thought about it, like it had been pre-programmed by years of conditioning. She looked at me skeptically, her eyes dropping to the hoodie pressed against my back and the stiff way I was standing. She asked where the burns were, and I said, upper back shoulders mostly. She didn't smile. Just handed me a clipboard and said, fill this out and we'll call you in. I sat in the waiting room for 20 minutes, every breath shallow as if the pain had settled into my lungs. I did not want to be there. I did not want to go home. I wanted to disappear somewhere between the white walls and fluorescent lights. When they finally called my name, a nurse led me to a room and helped me slide off the sweatshirt slowly. She flinched when she saw my back. I heard her breath catch. She said nothing but moved quickly to bring a cool compress and something numbing. When the doctor came in, he was in his 40s with tired eyes and a tone that suggested he had seen far too much. He asked what happened. I repeated the lie. Slipped carrying something hot. He nodded but did not believe me. I could feel it. He gently examined the burns and asked how old they were. I said last night. He paused, then asked, do you have any other injuries? I said no. He said, may I check anyway? I nodded. He touched along my spine, careful but firm, and when he got to the lower back, I winced. He asked how long that's been sore. I didn't answer. He said quietly, some of this bruising isn't from yesterday. Naomi, how often do accidents like this happen? I felt my throat tighten. I looked away. He didn't press further, just ordered imaging. Said he wanted to rule out spinal trauma. I lay in the MRI machine, staring at the inside of the dome above me, trying not to think about anything but the humming sound around my ears. When it was over, he came back with a folder and a changed expression. He said, you have signs of prior injury. Compressed vertebrae, healed fractures, minor scarring on soft tissue. The current burns are second degree, but what concerns me is the pattern. This isn't a single incident. This is repeated trauma. I sat very still. He said, I'm required to file a report when I suspect abuse. You don't have to talk about it now, but know this, what happened to you is not normal and it is not your fault. Something cracked in me. Then, not loud, not sudden, just the soft final snap of something stretched too thin for too long. I nodded once and asked, can I have the images? He said yes and printed them. He handed me copies of the scans and discharge paperwork and referrals for a physical therapist and a counselor. Then he did something I didn't expect. He looked at me and said, "You're not the first girl to come in with stories that don't match the injuries. But if you're the one who decides to speak up, it might be the last time it happens in your house." I took the envelope and walked out into the parking lot feeling like I was floating slightly above the ground. The weight in my chest had not lifted, but it had shifted. I got into the Uber without saying a word and sat with the folder clutched in my lap. The driver didn't speak, and I was grateful. I watched the streetlights smear past the window and thought about how many times I had walked through pain without anyone seeing it. Now I had proof, real proof. Not just words or memories, but scans and documentation and a doctor's voice saying, "This is real." It was the first time in my life someone had acknowledged what I had always known but had never dared say out loud. My pain was not a weakness. It was evidence. It was truth. And it was time to use it. When I got back to my apartment, I did not turn on the lights. I dropped the envelope of medical records on the coffee table and stared at it like it might open itself. My back was still raw, but it was the fire in my chest that consumed me. I paced the room until the sun came up, thinking about what the doctor said, about not being the first girl and what it would mean to finally say something. I remembered the screenshots of the group chat, my mother's cold text, Trevor's mocking response. The silence that had met me on that kitchen floor. I gathered everything. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. I labeled it Truth. I uploaded the MRI scans, the discharge papers, the screenshots. Then I added photos of the burns I had taken in the hospital bathroom with shaking hands. They were ugly, red, swollen, irrefutable. I stared at them until they stopped looking like parts of my body and became what they truly were, evidence. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at a name I had not seen in years. Camilla. We had been close in middle school before my father banned sleepovers and outside distractions. She had gone on to become a journalism student, then a reporter for the local paper. I hesitated for a full minute before hitting call. She picked up on the third ring. "Naomi," she said, "it's been forever." I swallowed hard and said, "I have a story. And I have the proof." Her tone shifted instantly. "Where are you?" she asked. We met that afternoon in a quiet cafe near the university. I wore loose clothes and kept shifting in my seat to avoid pressure on my back. She did not ask questions right away. She just listened. I told her everything. The years of being hurt, of being blamed, the pan, the burns of the hospital. I showed her the folder. She did not interrupt. When I was done, she leaned back and said, "Naomi, this is going to be big. Are you ready for that?" I nodded slowly. "I am not doing this for attention," I said. "I am doing this so no one else in that house ends up in a hospital bed." She smiled, but there was steel in her eyes. "Good," she said. "Let's do it right." We spent hours going over the timeline, piecing together dates and patterns. She asked if I had ever reported anything before, and I told her no. That was the truth, and that was the tragedy. But it would not stay that way. We decided to lead with the medical angle. She would write an exposé focused on the healthcare perspective, how doctors spot signs of abuse, how invisible wounds often go unspoken. My name would be changed for the first article, but the pictures would speak volumes. I wrote a personal essay to accompany it, raw and honest, explaining what it feels like to grow up in a house that hurts you and tells you it's your fault. She edited gently, leaving my words intact, but shaping them into something powerful. Before publishing, she sent it to a legal contact who confirmed the images and screenshots could be used under fair use since they related to a public interest case. The next day, the article went live. It was titled, "What Pain Leaves Behind," and it included 2 side-by-side images, one of my MRI scan showing old damage and one of the second-degree burns on my back. The post went up at noon. By 5, it had over 10,000 shares. Comments poured in from people I had never met, from survivors who saw their own stories reflected in mine, from strangers who offered shelter praise validation. My inbox flooded with offers for interviews, for support groups, for pro bono legal help. And then the message came from a woman named Andrea who ran a nonprofit for domestic abuse survivors. She said, "We saw your piece. If you're willing, we would like to amplify your voice." That night I sat in the dark again, but this time I did not feel alone. My pain had finally spoken and the world had listened. Not just with sympathy, but with anger. And that anger had power. I was not afraid anymore. I had crossed the line between silence and truth, and there was no going back. The article had only been live for a day when the private messages started. At first, they came from strangers who thanked me for speaking out, who said my story had given them the courage to finally name what had happened to them. But then came the messages from people who had my number, who knew my face, who carried my blood. The first was from my mother. She did not call. She sent a voice note 34 seconds long where her voice trembled not with remorse but with fury. She said, "How dare you expose us like that? What will the neighbors think? What will happen to your father if this ruins his life?" She did not mention the burns. She did not ask if I was okay. She only said, "You have humiliated us." The next came from Trevor. A text message, short, bitter. "You went too far. Whatever happened, you didn't have to make it public. Now Mom won't stop crying." The message ended with a sentence that made me grip the edge of the table. "You always were a little dramatic." I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. I screenshotted both the message and the voice note and added them to the folder on my desktop. Then I sat back and let myself feel it. Not the pain, not the anger, the clarity. They were not confused. They were not in shock. They were mad that I told. That I broke the rule we had all been raised on. What happens in this house stays in this house. The same rule that let bruises fade in silence. That let rage pass as parenting. That turned a girl into a scapegoat. They still believed they could shame me back into silence, but they were too late. That girl was gone. The folder of evidence was now in the hands of a lawyer. The story was out. The rallying had begun. Advocacy groups had picked up the piece. A podcast had reached out. Local news stations were quoting Camilla's article. The truth was too loud now. And still they whispered. Still they tried to pull me back with guilt and threats dressed in family ties. But I had learned something important. Survival is not betrayal, and silence is not loyalty. I did not reply to their messages. I did not block them either. I saved everything. Every word, every warning, because what they meant as intimidation was becoming a timeline. And the longer it got, the stronger my case became. I was not afraid of what they would say anymore. I had already heard the worst of it and lived. What scared them was not my words. It was that for the first time ever, I had chosen to say them where the world could hear. The day after my mother's voice message and Trevor's text, I met with the lawyer recommended by one of the advocacy groups that had reached out. Her name was Dana, and she didn't waste time. She reviewed the scans, the discharge reports, the screenshots, the photos, and the timeline I had built, and she looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Naomi, this is not only actionable, it's powerful. I can pursue both civil damages and open the door to criminal investigation. Do you want to press charges?" I hesitated for only a moment. "Yes," I said. "I want every lie burned down to the roots." That same afternoon, Camilla connected me with a producer from a local television network. They had read the article and wanted to feature my story in a segment about hidden domestic abuse. They were careful, respectful, clear that I could blur my name and face if I chose. But I said no. I had hidden long enough. If I was going to break this open, I wanted to do it completely. I arrived at the studio 2 days later, makeup covering the faint red that still marked the edges of the healing burns. The interviewer was kind but did not coddle. She asked what happened the night of the dinner, and I told her. Not with tears, not with trembling, but with the clear precision of someone who had lived with silence too long. I showed the scans. I read the messages. I spoke about what it meant to grow up in a home where fear wore a familiar face. The segment aired the next evening. It ran for 4 minutes and 23 seconds and ended with my voice saying, "I may carry the scars for life, but at least now they are no longer invisible." That clip went viral on its own. By morning, it had been shared by several national pages, including one focused on survivors of family violence. The comments turned into a wildfire of support. People from my hometown messaged saying they had always suspected something was off in our family but never dared speak. Teachers, neighbors, even an old church volunteer reached out to say, "I'm sorry I didn't know." One message in particular stood out. It was from Mrs. Halbrook, my high school biology teacher. She wrote, "I remember when you came to class one winter with bruises you said were from falling on ice. I knew then something wasn't right. I just didn't know how to help. I'm sorry, Naomi." I cried then, not because of the apology, but because for the first time someone had acknowledged the truth behind the excuses. The case gained traction. Local news picked it up. The restaurant my father used to run removed his name from the website. The town began to whisper and then to speak openly. What had once been taboo was now headline, and I stood in the center of it not as a victim but as a witness finally believed. I had crossed the line they always told me not to, and the world had not collapsed. It had opened. 2 weeks after the story aired, the police came to my parents' door with a warrant. I wasn't there, but I saw the footage on the news later, body cam clips, neighbors watching from their lawns, my mother standing in her robe with a frozen expression, and my father yelling at the officers like he still believed his voice had power. They led him away in handcuffs. The charges were formal aggravated assault endangerment of a minor for past incidents and obstruction related to threatening a witness me. The medical evidence, the texts, and my public statement had been enough to push it into open court. I attended the arraignment wearing a simple black blouse that didn't brush against my healing skin. He refused to look at me. My mother sat 2 rows behind him, arms crossed, her mouth tight. I felt no pity, only a heavy clarity. The judge denied bail due to the nature of the assault and the weight of the evidence. When I stepped outside, reporters were waiting. I stood still, took a breath, and said one sentence before walking past the microphones. Truth is louder than shame. That clip became its own wave online. People messaged me daily, strangers and friends, women and men, saying they saw their story in mine. It became something bigger than me. Survivors began using the hashtag #LouderThanShame to share their experiences. The nonprofit Andrea ran invited me to speak at their annual fundraiser. I agreed. That night, I stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people and told my story not as a victim, but as someone who had rebuilt herself from shattered silence. I said I used to think being strong meant enduring quietly, but I've learned it means speaking loudly even when your voice shakes. My words earned a standing ovation, but what mattered more were the hands that reached for mine afterward and the tears in the eyes of strangers who said thank you for saying it first. The trial date was set for November. My lawyer, Dana, prepared me for cross-examination for them to paint me as unstable, vindictive a liar. But every time I wavered, she reminded me they can twist words, but they cannot twist scans, bruises, or documented pain. On the first day of trial, I walked into the courthouse alone by choice. I wanted to feel every step. I wanted to know I got there without anyone holding my hand, because for years, no one had. In court, the prosecutors laid out a timeline so detailed it made my skin prickle. Camilla testified about the article, the verification process, the impact. Dana called the ER nurse and the doctor who had treated me. When he took the stand, he looked at me, then at the jury, and said, "Her injuries weren't new, and they weren't accidental." My father's lawyer argued I had exaggerated everything to ruin a man's reputation, but the facts drowned that argument. When I testified, I looked directly at the jury. I told them I loved books as a child because they were quiet and safe. I said I learned to cook because my father wanted someone to blame when things weren't perfect. I said the pain wasn't the worst part, it was the silence, and I was done being quiet. After 3 days of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. As the judge read the sentence, 15 years without parole, I felt something leave my body. Not relief, not victory, just release. Like I had been holding my breath for 13 years and finally exhaled. The morning after the sentencing, I woke up to silence. No court date circled on my calendar. No statements to rehearse. No interviews to prepare for. Just quiet. I brewed coffee slowly. I let the mug warm my hands and stood by the window, watching the sunlight move across the floor. For the first time in years, I did not flinch when the kettle whistled. I did not brace when a door slammed outside. The air felt new. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself, not to check for bruises, not to see if I had hidden my pain well enough to pass, but to just see me. My name was still Naomi, but something in me had changed so completely I barely recognized her. She stood straighter. She blinked slower. She looked back. In the weeks that followed, life began to stitch itself back together in different colors. I moved into a new apartment far from my family's neighborhood. I painted the walls in soft green and hung photos I had taken on long walks alone. I started volunteering at the nonprofit Andrea ran, sitting in small rooms with women who didn't speak above a whisper yet. I didn't give advice. I listened. I said things like, "You're not crazy," or "It wasn't your fault." And I meant every word. The story kept circulating. A documentary team reached out. I said yes. If my story helped even one girl put down the shame and pick up the phone, then it was worth all the scars. Trevor messaged me again once after the trial. A single sentence, "I hope you're happy now." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My happiness was no longer his concern. My story was mine again. The fear they used to shape me had been stripped of power. It still echoed sometimes in quiet moments when I opened the oven or walked past a mirror too quickly. But now I knew what to do with echoes. I spoke louder. One afternoon, I received a letter, handwritten, from Mrs. Halbrook. Inside was a photo of me at 16 presenting a science project with a caption that read, "She was always brilliant." The note said I kept this because I knew one day you'd remember who you were. I cried then because I had forgotten, but now I remembered. I was not broken. I was built. Bent, perhaps, but never beyond repair. My story was not a tragedy. It was a return. And every time I told it, I stitched another truth over the lies they once told me. I am not the girl who ruined dinner. I am the woman who told the world what happened when the pan hit skin and silence. And that woman is not afraid anymore.